Hello and welcome to OLA 2020. Thank you so much for joining us on this session on understanding metadata, what it is, why it's important, and how to use it. My name is Elizabeth Skirpin-Estes. I am this year's chair of the Technical Services Roundtable, or TSRT, and I'm so happy to moderate this session. I'm joined today by our session's presenter, Madison Chartier. Madison is the metadata librarian for Oklahoma State University Library. She creates, remediates, and reviews metadata for OSU's digital collections. She is also responsible for workflow development in the metadata department. She holds an MLIS from Indiana University Bloomington with a concentration in archives and records management. I'll be back at the end of the session with some questions for our presenters, but right now I want to turn it over to Madison. Madison, take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And yes, hello, everybody, and thank you again. I'm very happy to be a part of OLA. This is my first time, and certainly an unprecedented time, to be sure. So I hope everyone is continuing to stay safe and healthy. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. And I hope this overview and introduction to metadata may prove insightful and useful. But metadata is an increasingly integral component of modern libraries. Metadata facilitates not only the end user research experience, it also facilitates the librarian's role in describing and managing resource material. The metadata enables the successful use, the sharing, and the overall management of resource materials by providing structure to resource description. And this structure, coupled with supporting guidelines, tools, and standards, enables resource discoverability, systems interoperability, and improved resource management and maintenance, all of these being very integral in today's digital information age. So establishing metadata practices in a library, they can pose challenges. We're introducing something that's still very new, very ongoing development to long-established practices. And the complexity only increases when taking available technology, funds, and staff into consideration. It's a messy trial and error process, and it can be a slow-going process, but it is a challenge worth embracing. So establishing solid metadata practices has the ability to expand an institution's impact through greater dissemination of research wealth. Metadata helps establish connections between otherwise isolated resources and helps link them to a greater meaningful body of field work and research. It's really just a matter of taking some initial steps and figuring out what you can implement now to help your library on a course for continued future progress. So today, I would like to offer a broad foundational overview of metadata. And as part of that, I would like to offer a definition of what metadata is and to outline the benefits it brings to library practices, namely resource discoverability, systems interoperability, and efficient resource management. I would also like to introduce a fundamental tool, metadata application profile, that might be incorporated to help lay a foundation for metadata practices in a library. And to illustrate this tool's usage, I'll also talk a little bit about OSU's metadata department and our experiences and some of the considerations we've made in defining and growing and kind of solidifying our metadata practices with our available staff and systems. And I'll then conclude with a brief summation of these points. So what is metadata? Well, metadata is still a new emergent practice, but it stems from something already quite familiar to us. This is evidenced in the way that a wide variety of ways that different institutions treat metadata and cataloging. Some treat them as separate practices headed by different departments, while others together as related practices under the same department. But no matter the institutional organization, metadata has always been there with libraries, an invisible inherent practice. It's just that now with so much digital information at hand, metadata has become a more manifest, engineered practice to facilitate this new age and character of information exchange. Now, often what most people may hear when introduced to metadata for the first time is it's data about data. And this is a cryptic statement, but it has a kernel of truth. Because metadata is not just the method of describing resources, it is the practice of organizing and identifying each piece of resource description with a clearly defined label. So this, I may be preaching to the choir here, but this is what libraries are traditionally known for, the card catalog. And here's where resources are described and what users can consult to figure out where to find this resource within the physical space of the library. And looking at this example here, many of us may know what all these bits of information represent. Albert Camus is the author of the work. The Stranger is the title. Not only is it the title, but it's the translated English title. These pieces of information, they're not explicitly labeled, but through our consistent usage and setup of the language on each card in the card catalog, we intuitively understand what kind of information a resource each of these textual streams represents. The practice has become so ingrained in human minds that really we don't have to contemplate how exactly we organize this description. That is metadata. Metadata is that underlying structure, that intuitive understanding of what each piece of information is. It's just that now we've made it a distinct manifest practice by assigning explicit labels to those aspects of resource description. And it has been made a manifest practice with the development of computers. A computer does not have the same natural ability as a human mind to infer what each of these pieces of information represents. A computer needs told what this information is. So metadata, we can really consider it as bibliographic description that's been adapted for the digital age. Now, the metadata universe is very vast in its scope, and I'll show you a glimpse of just how much in a little bit, but I want to cover just a small snippet of kind of developmental history with metadata, just to explain a concept that I know was originally baffling to me when first coming on board in the metadata field, and it may be a source of confusion worth taking a moment to clear up. And this also leads us into a concept on which metadata tends to hinge quite a bit, and has also led to a lot of rules surrounding and guiding metadata practices. With this history, metadata's development, this has been in pursuit of the appropriate balance between the end goal of machine readability for computers, but also human compatibility for librarians and end users having to work with this metadata. And this effort establishing balance has famously led to two branches of metadata schema, where you have MARC metadata, MARC being machine readable cataloging, and then non-MARC metadata. And for those who may be unfamiliar, I'm using the term schema. A metadata schema is a particular set of available labels or fields, as we may commonly refer to them, to capture certain aspects of resource description. So while schema may share similar fields, different schema may have different rules for how these fields are used, what values are entered, and how those values are formatted. Now, machine readable cataloging, this was the first broadly recognized schema to accomplish machine readability and to initiate digital dissemination of research through organizational labeling of resource description. But MARC as a schema isn't founded on naturally intuitive practices for human librarians. This particular schema, as you can see in the example, it uses alphanumeric code for its labels. And this requires an active translation associating those codes to the textual value they represent. Now, non-MARC metadata schemas, this group derives their name from the fact that they have drifted away from MARC's alphanumeric code labels. Non-MARC schemas seek to facilitate librarians' work with resource description by using natural language labels in their schema. So text-based labels to match text-based values, this helps accomplish machine readability still, while permitting better comprehension and overall greater ease for librarians creating or reading metadata records. Both branches of schema accomplish the same end of machine readability, but the desire for really overall efficiency and friendliness of schema has led to the promotion of more natural language usage. Mark and non-mark schemas have kind of shifted into their own spheres. So for the present time being, at least, mark continues to dominate long-standing traditions of the cataloging world, while non-mark schema now have really kind of taken to define or strongly associate with the more modern, continually evolving world of metadata. Oh, there we go, yay. Scary, I froze for a second. Okay, so now making metadata language-based in a machine-driven practice, this is both a blessing and a curse. Natural language usage, it has made non-mark metadata more readily accessible and comprehensible for library professionals to work with. Metadata, in this way, metadata records really can function very much like architectural blueprints. Librarians are able to structure and maintain clear descriptive records of resources that users can successfully navigate and understand. In addition to resource description, librarians can even detail administrative and preservation procedures. The benefit of this is that everyone who views the metadata can have an understanding of what the resource is, what it is about, how it has been maintained, what software is supporting it, if applicable, and when records were last edited. So maintains the integrity of the record as well as verifies the integrity of the institution maintaining it. However, while facilitating human compatibility, metadata built around language construct, it also becomes kind of vulnerable. I say this because language is incredibly flexible and it's also incredibly versatile. And structure depends on consistency of language with metadata and a clearly defined support. So therefore, the introduction of language as the main medium metadata practices required that additional considerations and rules be introduced and enforced. And this is to make sure that one person viewing the same architectural blueprint, continuing with that metaphor, can read, interpret, and navigate as successfully as another individual. So here's what I mean by language and structure. While language can afford precision and clarity in metadata, this metadata can be only truly effective in permitting broad use and access to content to the extent that the language used is consistent and mutually recognized. A library institution outside your own have the ability to recognize the structure of the metadata record and to interpret it successfully. By establishing consistent structure and resource description, you enable the still benefits of metadata. And this is ultimately why we're pursuing metadata, in order to allow for the greater dissemination of knowledge digitally by accomplishing these three aspects of resource discoverability, systems interoperability, and more efficient resource management. Now, resource discoverability, this is the initial root and aim of all metadata. Discoverability hinges upon capturing those aspects of resource description most integral to identifying and retrieving a resource. When labeled, values become defined as access points. A user conducting search queries will retrieve records continuing the specific words of that search query under a specific identified field or label. Successful resource discovery, therefore, depends on metadata that clearly identify aspects of resource description by which a user may readily pinpoint and find a desired resource. It's important then to create and support metadata that can satisfy this end. And to do that, you need to really consider both things. And the first consideration is what sort of descriptive details will best enable user access. And this This includes not only a resource specifics like a title, author, publication date, but also user consideration of user interests. What's the subject matter? What field of research is it relevant to? Maybe it's important to know how the resource came to be and why is it significant in modern research. Or in an ongoing ambition with metadata and linked data now, what other resource materials may be related to it or relevant for continuing research. The second consideration then is what metadata schemas and vocabularies will best capture those points of description identified as integral to describe resources accurately while answering user interests and needs. And this second consideration is where discoverability and interoperability really begin to interact. Interoperability is the capability of different information systems to exchange and successfully render digital resources. Systems have to be able to speak the same metadata language or translate effectively between data languages. Interoperability, therefore, it kind of depends on a universality of metadata language, a common language. Now, when metadata started, there were no rules or standardized ways to create metadata. Everyone was coming up with their own schema and their own values. And it wasn't until people started trying to share their digital resources that it became apparent no one was speaking the same metadata language. Computers couldn't effectively exchange and render each other's resources. So to overcome this figurative language barrier, descriptive practices, schemas, and values, these needed to be, we needed to develop to make them universally recognized and adopted by all systems and institutions. And to facilitate this universality, we needed to narrow our metadata universe to a few select guidelines that could recommend and support mutually agreed upon schemas and values. And what we came up with was really actually a very coordinated system of tools that support each other, where we have content description standards, open source metadata schemas, and controlled vocabularies. Now, these images right on the slide, these are actually two halves of the same chart developed by a metadata professional by the name of Jen Riley when she was at Indiana University, Bloomington. And I'm including them here in this presentation because they really offer a great visualization of how metadata and tools associated with metadata have come to shape a more effectively organized practice. I mentioned earlier content description standards. These standards help prioritize and keep resource discoverability in mind by identifying integral aspects of description to target other elements, including other such as administrative functions and preservation planning. Metadata schemas then help consistently structure and label those recommended descriptive details for effective discovery, resource exchange, and collection management. And many of these schemas are designed as open, non-proprietary standards. They are free to use, and they are developed by committed teams of information professionals who are able to plot long-term solutions for these metadata schemas, especially as new circumstances and descriptive needs emerge with continued developments of the field. So now with content description standards and open metadata schemas established, we can then actually go a level deeper in focusing on specific values entered into those fields. And this is where we have the establishment of controlled vocabularies and also authority files to facilitate universality of specific field values, such as genres and subterms, and on the flip side, author names and geographic references. By establishing and applying vocabulary terms and name formats across fields that are universally applied to all collections, relationships can be more effectively established between resources that cover the same subjects or persons. Now, giving more solid shape and structure to metadata schema enabled another influential set of tools to be developed to help support and promote metadata implementation. And these are actually systems, institutional repositories and content management systems. Now, repositories and management systems, these are functional working spaces that can really help shape metadata practices. Within the safety of these controlled environments, consistency of practice and compliance with metadata standards can be enforced. Experiments can also be safely conducted, especially as you're exploring maybe a transition to a new metadata schema or making data changes. You experiment with within these environments and even correct those experiments that don't go quite as planned. Institutional repositories and content management systems, with the development of these systems, we will also be able to introduce the possibility of automated procedures, facilitating batch processes and workflows that would create metadata consistently and more efficiently. And we could additionally introduce the development of supplementary tools that could, say, help track resource usage by their metadata. And this assessment of user interests can help and improve other aspects of library management, like collection development. Where should the priorities be? So as metadata has enhanced the need and utility for such systems and library practice, so too have these systems had an actual reciprocal benefit in further defining and refining metadata practice. Because through the establishment of these safe, controlled digital environments, we've been able to expand the character and function of metadata. Now, it'll depend on what schema you use. Some schema, metadata can facilitate not only content description, but it can also document, say, the complex history of provenance. It can also detail the technical specifications of digital objects. It can detail the migrations those objects have undergone as part of preservation. And it can even keep audit trails of all the administrative actions taken to preserve and maintain the integrity of digital resources. And this expanded metadata has helped shape repositories and systems to fulfill all the needs of a physical archival institution, including security protocols regarding professional access and even editing permissions with metadata. So now that, my hope is that we've kind of helped establish an understanding of what metadata is and how it has developed as a practice to bring specific advantages to library functions. The next is now kind of taking a step further to understand how to start considering theoretical ideals of metadata practice and maybe how to start implementing and applying them using available institutional resources. Now, assessing your institution's resources, this is integral because it will help you determine what you have to lay a foundation for your metadata practices. And once you have this foundation, then you'll be able to build and establish metadata creation guidelines that will enforce consistency of practice across all collection contents while respecting the tools you have available to support your metadata and content. In terms of available resources, the ideal situation that everyone hopes for is that you have everything in the world you imagine need for implementing metadata at its most present advanced stage of development. You have all the ample experienced staff, you have seats funding, you have your pick of all the most tailored advanced technologies out there, and you have the freedom to choose which system you like based on what suits your collections best. However, the more common reality that we all face is certain fixed parameters. We have limited staffing who are stretched across multiple projects and priorities. We have limited funding. We have limited time. Systems we implement are often those that we can reasonably afford and successfully man with what we have in our staff and funds. And as a result, metadata we have to work with, it may require a bit of inventiveness and innovation and research to make sure that we are using that metadata effectively to capture the best to capture best a vast range of description with a small array of available and kind of be more generalized fields. So you can make work for your collections. This is another important consideration when choosing systems and tools like schema. You need to select tools that will answer collection needs. So you might have to ask yourself, what kind of resources are in your collections? Are they consistent in genre and material, or they vary? Can you make do with purely descriptive metadata, or does your institution require additional measures like preservation and administrative metadata? We have to ask these questions because different kinds of resources will have description needs. Images require a different treatment than text-based resources. An informal student project will not have the same requirements as a professionally published faculty paper. And collection needs will help us identify where in the metadata universe we need to find an appropriate data schema to work with. Different metadata schemas have different focal points. Some are broad, general in scope. Some are quite narrow in their focus. Some tailor to very specific information institutions and research communities, while others focus on very specific functions of metadata, like, again, description, preservation, or even collection structure. So we have to juggle these considerations with the particular system we're working with. Is a particular schema supported on that system? What fields are available within the supported schema? What flexibilities do you have in adapting or adding to preset metadata fields in that system? And additionally, how do you have to format values, both for compliance with broader metadata standards, but maybe also for the system to be able to read? There are certain parameters like that that can take place. And this is where metadata application profiles, or maps, as we often call them, these help document those considerations and the solutions you kind of develop for them. Maps help define metadata practices at both the institutional level and also on a project-by-project basis. They identify what fields are needed to cover a collection's description. And they do this in consideration of the fields available within the system you're working with. And they offer guidelines on how to populate those fields according to broader metadata standards. Say, if we're keeping to an architectural metaphor, also maps, they can kind of function a bit like building code standards. They stipulate and hold metadata creators accountable that all the working pieces of an institution's metadata practices are there to help reinforce structure and consistency with metadata creation. And they also serve the function as appropriately called maps to guide you through that process. Now, I've introduced a number of considerations, overview, and it can sometimes feel overwhelming when learning to understand what metadata is, what it enables, and really what factors could impact how libraries start building and implementing their own metadata practices. And I don't want anyone to be stressed. So to provide an illustration of these considerations and really the process of kind of working through them, I'd like to share a little bit about OSU's metadata deployment experiences and how we've worked to establish our practices, tools, and resources we have. So this here is our website outlining our department metadata team. And when considering a resource available, our team is small, and that is very true. But to clarify, it's not as small as this website suggests. What this site indicates is we have one professional faculty member schooled in metadata, may be considered the functioning metadata expert. Now, as this expert, I develop workflows that capitalize on the metadata team's available staff and skills. Those are the resources I have to work with. I develop maps for new collections in accordance with larger institutional guidelines we've developed for metadata. And also review and update old maps for more dated collections whose metadata no longer complies with current metadata standards. So I'm one part of this team, but in addition, we also have our department head who helps identify project priorities and even coordinate desired outcomes for some of the systems we're working with. And COVID-19 has certainly changed a lot, but usually we've tended to support also about 6 student employees whom I train and oversee in metadata creation and remediation. Now, our department it reflects a reality that is actually quite common to many libraries who are early in their metadata development. Employees with translatable skills are often asked to come on board, initiate the trial and error process to get a metadata department up and running. And as the department kind of grows from that experimental process, then gradually additional professionals with specific metadata training and experience can gradually be added to the team to help further shape and strengthen those new versioning departments. The important thing to remember is that metadata is still brand new, really for everyone. Many professionals in metadata today learned metadata on the job from that process of trial experience. And many library schools themselves are still developing metadata programs. So with metadata, you can almost trust that everyone is currently in, or at least started off in, the same boat. The knowledge and working experience with metadata came from building metadata departments, using the resources that were available, establishing maps and consistent practices, and gradually introducing new tools, techniques, bit to improve those aims of discoverability, interoperability, and good resource management. So continuing to look at our resources, at OSU, we have 2 systems supporting our collections. We have Space, the platform for our institutional repository, ShareOK, where we house our academic papers and publications. We also have Content DM, which is a platform for OSU digital collections. And here we house a digitized analog collection, such as photographs, yearbooks, posters, etc. Now, these system softwares are adopted because each offers a good starting foundation metadata. They each have metadata guidelines set up to get you started, but also offer flexibility that can be desirable for those starting to work with metadata and having to navigate certain complications with specific collection needs. Collections may defy the usual norm. Now, DSpace permits customization that can prove useful in adopting and adapting certain elements of different schemas to help support a broad range of resource materials and genres. And DM also permits some customization and metadata creation through what's known as qualification or refinement of suggested metadata fields. And this qualification or refinement works by appending additional labels to the end of a central field. So this allows us to tailor fields as necessary for greater specificity. But now, if you recall earlier in this discussion, especially when I was talking about the big bang of the metadata universe, I mentioned that a lot of customization and localization of metadata schema actually proved to the detriment of interoperability early on in metadata developments. Now, to clarify, OSU, we do still customize some of our metadata, but we do so now on a very controlled, limited scale, tailored very specifically to certain collection needs. Now, when OSU's metadata department first started, we generated a lot of customized metadata on ShareOK, and we qualified the daylights out of fields on content. And it came to the labels we were using gradually drifted further and further from the proposed schema in both systems, and we were really just following our own rules. And now this extensive freedom to customize our metadata, while originally promising that we could get very specific to each collection and highlight all the unique components of each collection, it ultimately compromised our ability to have our metadata harvested and to have our resources shared with other institutions. It was so local to our usage. And additionally, our data management suffered. We were creating field names indiscriminately and without consistency that later development of maps really helped us establish. So early on, we had no consistent field names occurring between collections by which we could target and assess values across those collections. So it kind of rendered collection analysis very difficult in our holdings. So having flexible systems, this can be valuable when first learning how to implement and support metadata. But you have to consider standards to give that system boundaries and guidelines. Because again, in order for that system to supply your needs and create effective metadata, you need to consider discoverability, interoperability, and resource management. So this is why the establishment of maps, the selection of an open metadata schema, and a committed awareness of content standards are so important for libraries seeking to implement effective metadata practices. Now, determining which schema is best to use and learning how to use it, this may be challenging and overwhelming. Again, if you follow Riley's diagram, the field has been narrowed down, but there's still quite a few options to choose from. However, in almost all initial endeavors with metadata, especially when first learning to work metadata and understanding what it is, Dublin Core is really the one schema that tends to prove consistently true and invaluable in getting some metadata practices running. And Dublin Core is a simple schema, and it's considered the founder of most modern metadata schemas. It was the first schema really developed to answer all the fundamental needs of bibliographic resource description in as simple and as widely applicable a manner as possible, using only 15 natural language-based fields. Dublin Core is an open source schema, and this schema has been actively maintained since its initial conception and use to make sure it still applies to modern resource description needs. And this has led to the development of its, well, it's sister, I'm not sure if that's the exact right comparison, but the continued work on Dublin Core has led to the development of qualified Dublin Core. You still have the original 15 foundational fields of Dublin Core, but then you can add refining labels to those fields if greater specificity is needed under certain circumstances. What do I mean by that? Now, for example, see in the second column at the top, you have the contributor field, dc.contributor. Say, referring back to our Albert Camus card catalog example earlier, say you need to attribute not only the author, which in this case would most aptly be DC creator, but say you also have an editor and a translator to attribute. Now you could just go with the overall DC.contributor field, but if you wanted to really get more specific, you could attribute the editor using the appended label editor, dc.contributor.editor. And the same applies for the translator, where you would append the translator label to dc.contributor.translator. Now at OSU, we were fortunate that both DSpace and ContentGem offered a good starting ground, as both of these systems make recommendations of fields drawn from Dublin Core and qualified Dublin Core. But apart from our own experience and familiarity with Dublin Core, we really would highly advocate Dublin Core as a good schema to start building metadata with, because virtually everyone knows Dublin Core. It can be shared everywhere. You can still cover the wide variety of resource material you may have, and you can answer your fundamental description needs. And at the same time, you're still facilitating the benefits of interoperability and consistency of practice for improved resource management. So it's definitely something to consider. So adopting an open source schema like Dublin Core, that's an important step. But the next most important is to developing your maps for collections, because these will help guide the accurate usage of that schema you're working with. And here, this is an example of a map that we have created and used at OSU for our electronic theses and dissertations collection. All of our maps kind of follow a very similar template. We use an Excel spreadsheet, and the first column A, this stipulates the meta fields that the metadata librarian has determined necessary to describe the collection in question. And these fields, we look at the collection, kind of considering the needs of the collection, but we also compare that to the particular system to which the collection metadata will be uploaded. In this case, we use DSpace, so we have to consider what fields are available on DSpace. Now, the columns following, these include formatting guidelines. Say column B, you look at row 6, you have indication for date that we prefer a numeric structure of the 4-digit year and a 2-digit month. We also indicate the schema from which certain elements may be drawn, or certain guidelines that we are referring to help structure that. Our comments column, this is often used to include more detailed instructions, especially on how to populate free text fields like titles. Titles can be very important for that. Column E, we have a registry, and this sometimes depends. We often include hyperlinks here to kind of direct people who are creating the metadata to additional resources to consult, especially say maybe if you need to work with a controlled vocabulary and a suggested term in the value field doesn't quite work, they can use the link in the registry to be able to reach out and search for a more appropriate term. And then finally, column F, we have examples of how these fields may be correctly complete and formatted. Okay. So the map, this serves as your guide and reference while creating collection metadata. The goal is to get from the map on the left to the metadata file on the right. Now, in this case, we're using the metadata file on the right. This is the comma-separated values file. The file format you use, this may depend on the system you're working with. Because we're working with DSpace, we have to use a comma-separated values file for this collection to input metadata. That's how this is set up. Now, in reading the metadata file, the column naming the fields in the map, this becomes the header row, row 1, metadata file. Each row following them represents each record to be uploaded. So all the theses and dissertations for this collection that are going to be uploaded, they're okay. Each cell then contains the appropriate, properly formatted value describing that record for the field under which it falls. And again, we follow the map guidelines and populate those fields. So I know that this image is very small, so here's a more blown up image. And my understanding is that we have the option of supplying some supplementary material to help assist in kind of reviewing and understanding this presentation. So I will be supplying digital copies of the map and this example metadata file as well with my presentation slides. So you guys can have the option of continually referring back to these just as examples to kind of get you thinking about how to read metadata. All right, so, well, we made it. But metadata, this can be a tricky subject to cover in an overview. And it's because it's such an expansive field with resounding impact. And presently, every institution, we're getting closer, but each institution handles it differently according to, again, available resources and again, collection needs. But what I hope this overview has helped provide is a sense of not only the importance and the benefit, but also the feasibility of adopting metadata practices in library workflows. And implementing metadata does have its challenges and requires dedicated effort and time, But ultimately, metadata, it is that rewarding enhancement of libraries' ability to serve user needs and disseminate greater knowledge. Again, it enables that resource discoverability through the progressive development and application of open source schemas, controlled vocabularies, and content description standards to guide our practices. It also accomplishes systems interoperability, which in turn helps broaden user access, and it offers libraries the chance to improve their resource management through the ability to have better collection analysis and even identification of user interests and needs. So I cannot stress enough metadata. This is a key, it's key in driving continued developments of modern libraries pursuing digital information exchange. And every library should have the chance to develop their own practices and partake in the advantages and steps you can take, and you can start taking them now. So again, thank you all so very much for listening in on this presentation. And again, I do hope it was useful and insightful for you. And again, please everyone continue to stay safe under these circumstances, and hopefully I'll be operating back in our libraries soon. And just here's an additional slide for some of the images I was grateful enough to use in this presentation. But at this point in time, then, I guess, Elizabeth, do we have any questions?
Thank you so much, Madison. One of my first questions I had was, how did you recommend an individual really wanting to learn more about metadata get started?
Oh, geez.
I know, it's sort of a loaded question.
Sometimes a lot of it's just being able to kind of network and actually getting the insights of really working professionals who are getting involved with it. I really do find that networking been one of the most insightful experiences, because those are people in the thick of it. But there are also books that are being increasingly published that are exploring the concept of metadata. And I know one that really got me started and kind of hooked, and ultimately determining that I wanted to pursue a career in metadata was simply the title of Metadata. It's by Jeffrey Pomerantz. And it really does offer good foundational understanding of, again, like the development of metadata from a historical perspective, and also what it's trying to accomplish. So I would recommend that book as a good way to kind of get started, maybe as an understanding to develop in that way.
That's really great. My next question was, where do you see metadata going in future years? I know there's been some rapid developments in the last several years, and it's been an ongoing effort almost as long as the internet's been around. But in this, world driven, especially with libraries towards the semantic web, really, where do you see metadata ending up at?
Oh, geez, yeah. Because I know, and right now it's such an interesting thing, because we're all kind of still striving to catch up with each other a little. And again, some of us are still, it's all spread, where some are still at the very beginning and developing a foundation for metadata, and others are really kind of on the advanced cutting edge of saying, okay, we've got a foundation, but where can we press and explore? But I know, like, one of the biggest things going on right now, and I know it's something I'm still would love to be an active part of it, and still I'm trying to actively research more about, is the concept of linked data. And the idea of this is that we're actually using more URIs, uniform resource identifiers, as part of metadata. So that way that resources are actually more easily connected with each other. You could look at one resource and find like, say for example, like subject terms, instead of using just textual strings to represent like subject term, what would happen is a URI would be plugged in for that term. You click the URI, and that would lead you to a whole other area where it lists additional resources that could be linked to that fellow subject. So the idea is that it's growing into what's called the semantic web, where the ultimate vision is that every resource can be traced to additional related resources pertaining to the same subject matter or originating from the same person. it's a great undertaking, and it's so vast and drastic. It's amazing, and it's going to take an extensive amount of time to develop. At the same time, so many projects like Wikidata are underway that are striving to introduce that gradually and get people on board with it. But presently, I do see metadata continuing to strive more towards that, where our world is no longer just, as I say, kind of like isolated resources within isolated institutions per se, but that everything has the potential to be linked together.
That's a really fantastic answer. Thank you. And I think last but not least, do you see metadata as being interoperable with some of the library semantic web efforts? I think BibFrame is by far the most well-known, and I think where at least the Library of Congress is pushing librarians.
Yeah, no, and and I'm there's admittedly so much I'm still trying to learn. And I will admit that I am an earlier professional myself. I'm just out of the rain in terms of my training, but it is a gradual effort. I know there are BibFrame's popular, but I know there's also another thing like the resource description framework, which is actually striving. What that framework does is actually strives to be able to pull in multiple different schemas, give them a space in which they can work together, and still be able to introduce some aspects of linked data and linking. Because I do believe there are some might be outside my present realm of experience right now to really comment effectively on. I do believe that there are some schemes right now that might be a little too limited and narrow in scope, be able to successfully make that leap to incorporating things like linked data practices without some adjustment and maintenance and updates. But I do think there is great potential, and again, because I know BibFrame, and I'm trying to remember the development of BibFrame, because I do think I believe that is progressing like from developments on Mark, and I believe there have been some contemplations that the BibFrame could one day potentially replace Mark, but yeah, I might be getting a little rambled outside my present experience and answer this question. But as I say, it's a growing field. So I'd like to kind of like say optimistically that nothing is impossible, and that there are ways to grow from present schemas towards a brighter future on technological developments and visions like the semantic web. Whether it's developing something new like BibFrame and having to say goodbye to a more outdated version, or maybe for something like the resource description framework, where, okay, we've got a whole bunch of schemas that all still might have value, and making them maybe work together and be able to adapt to that new circumstance.
Madison, thank you so much for presenting at OLA 2020, and thanks to everyone for joining us in this session. If you really enjoyed this session, I would encourage you to consider joining the Technical Services Roundtable of the OLA. We provide support for technical type librarians through free and low-cost training, online support, and camaraderie, and we'd love to have you. Please remember to complete a session evaluation in the OLA conference app, and we hope you'll join us for many more conference sessions. Thank you all so much for joining us.